Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd and this is my review of episode 6 of season 5 of Lower Decks. And I think it was one of the silliest episodes of the show because it felt kind of childish and simplistic and not really that interesting. I don't mind the basic ideas of it, but just the way it was done was not really that entertaining in my opinion. It also ties back to one of the silliest episodes of the original Star Trek show, the one when Kirk met some Greek gods on some other planet, and it turns out that they were just powerful aliens who once visited Earth in the past, and that created all those legends about the Greek gods. And I don't mind that basic idea. It's one that was done a lot of times in all the Star Trek shows, and also in Stargate SG-1 they did a lot of ideas like that. But in that old episode of TOS, it was just kind of ridiculous the way everything was exactly like their depictions in the Earth legends. Wouldn't they be at least slightly different? I mean, they should be similar, but wouldn't the stories either get exaggerated or at least altered over centuries and all of that? And yet they look exactly like in their pictures of Earth. And also their magical powers, like the literal hand holding the Enterprise in space, was just kind of too ridiculous for my taste. And in the later Star Trek shows, this idea was done much better. For example, in the TNG episode about Ardra, was basically an alien scam artist who was pretending to be a deity of some other planet in order to try to enslave that planet, and so Picard had to expose her as being a fraud and using technology to emulate magical powers and all of that. So that was a great episode. And as I mentioned in Stargate SG-1, they showed that the Goa'uld aliens were pretending to be gods to enslave humans. The only problem I had with Stargate SG-1 is that over time, over 10 seasons of that show, it became kind of ridiculous that it turned out that every single legend on Earth was based on some kind of alien who visited it. And so over time it became ridiculous, because are you telling me that not a single one of the legends of Earth was just made up? Not a single one was just a total fabrication, just an invention? Every single one of them was based on an actual alien. And so over time it became kind of ridiculous because it became repetitive. And also it kind of annoyed me how in SG-1 they never said anything about any of the main big religions who still exist today. They only poked fun at the ancient religions, but they never touched the big ones of today. And a few times I think they did kind of imply that Jesus was one of those ancient humanoids who had powers like him, that they could heal people, and they could ascend into an energy form and come back to life, and they could impregnate women without having sex with them. And so one time they kind of implied it a little bit when I think Carter said, "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" And then Teal'c said, "Anakin Skywalker was also born without a father," and all of that. So that was kind of funny, but it was kind of annoying how they were afraid to offend any of the main religions. So I much prefer the way Star Trek kind of used the metaphors to kind of make people think for themselves and understand why religion can be bad. But with this idea that aliens came to Earth and that's what inspired the religions, it's a fine science fiction idea, but it also implies that no one ever just made up a story, no one ever just made up some god from their imagination. Everything was basically true from the storyteller's point of view. They actually did see some creature with powers, and they wrote it down. And so it kind of gives too much credit to humans of the past being so truthful. They actually wrote down what they actually saw, and I think that's not the case. So that's a small problem I had with that whole idea of aliens visiting Earth in the past and becoming our gods. So anyway, this episode of Lower Decks introduced a character who has that laurel on her head. And it turns out she's the granddaughter of Zeus, who was one of those aliens that Kirk once met, one of them called Apollo. And so Zeus apparently had a lot of kids with humanoids, with mortals, and she was his granddaughter, and yet she claimed not to have any magical powers, and later in the episode it turns out she does, which explains how earlier in the episode they keep showing her messing things up accidentally, and it turns out it's because she doesn't control her powers, so she causes electrical malfunctions all over the ship. And as always, there are a lot of member berries. For example, we see Worf's chair from TNG, which I think that prop also appeared in an episode of Friends. And I'm starting to get the suspicion that someone might be watching my Major Green videos and taking notes, because anytime I make a compilation of some interesting prop that shows up a lot in Star Trek, suddenly a few months later I see it in an episode of Lower Decks. And so maybe it's a coincidence, or maybe someone is watching my videos and taking notes, I don't know. But anyway, that's a nice member berry. We also get to see a Dabo table in that pile of stuff. Also, we finally get an explanation why is Boimler trying to grow a beard. Apparently, it's because ever since he saw that other Boimler from the parallel reality who had a beard and he was a much cooler guy, and he kept a data pad from that other ship and he's reading it, and so he's trying to emulate that other Boimler who was cooler, and he's trying to become like him, and that's why he's trying to grow a beard, and he's also trying to become best friends with the ship's doctor like he was in that other reality, and so he keeps trying to befriend her in this episode and it doesn't really work. And he just gets assaulted by her because he tried to speak in her language by cursing all the time, and then she gets annoyed and scratches him and assaulting him, and that's funny, I guess, because assaulting a fellow Starfleet officer is totally normal and doesn't have any repercussions. And the bigger story of the episode is about the Cerritos trying to settle a conflict between two warring energy entities inside some giant nebula that used to be two different nebulas that collided with each other, and so ever since then these two groups of entities are fighting each other. So one of them are spheres and the other ones are cubes, and that's why they hate each other, even though they're basically the same kind of entity. And we did see those kinds of entities in all kinds of episodes of Star Trek, especially in TNG. I remember there were those kinds of spherical entities inside some nebula that we once saw in TNG, and it's kind of strange, why would any entities become cube-shaped? Also, they specifically say they are made from pure energy, so how come they have any physical shape at all? And also, how come they leave physical residue around if they're made from pure energy? So some of the dialogue in this episode was kind of silly. And this new character who pretends not to have any powers, and in the end she does, and she's trying to hide her powers, is also kind of silly. It felt like another Mariner, like she's being kind of annoying. And I guess it was done deliberately because Mariner is now a more mature character, and so she sees herself, her old self, in this new character and trying to guide her to fit in better and whatever. So again, some of the ideas are nice, but the execution is not that good in my opinion. So this new character has just been annoying and just messing things up, and the thing on her head doesn't make any sense, and they specifically say that that's a biological property, that it's something that grows out of her head that she cannot remove if she wants to. So that's also kind of a silly idea. Couldn't you surgically remove it, or couldn't you cover it with more hair to hide it or something? So why do you mean you cannot remove it and you have to display it even though you don't want to? So that doesn't really make any sense. And speaking of appearances, there's another detail I wanted to talk about in previous reviews as well, I kept forgetting to mention it, is that across this whole show we see characters in the background wearing all kinds of religious headgear, and I don't mind the show wanting to show more diversity and showing all the different groups of humanity. All of that is nice, but in the context of Starfleet it seems a little bit strange to show officers walking around with religious symbols, because wasn't there an episode of TNG when Riker didn't want to allow Ro Laren to wear her Bajoran earring, which is a religious symbol, because he said it's against the Starfleet regulations and she had to take it off? And so how come in this show we see so many background characters wearing all kinds of religious items? And again, I don't have a specific problem with it, I just find it a little bit weird. Isn't Star Trek kind of classically against religion and usually showed humanity of the future kind of being free from religion? And so how come there are so many religious looking characters in the background? It just seems a little bit strange. I don't mind if they actually dealt with that topic, if they actually had such a character on screen and speaking and explaining it, saying, oh, it's really rare in our day and age, but yes, some people are still religious. That's totally fine. I will totally be okay with that idea. I'm not in favor of banning religion or forcing people to dress in strict rules and all of that. So I'm fine with the idea of showing diversity. I just wish they would have dealt with that topic more directly and not just virtue signal it by showing some characters like that in the background once in a while, and then you check that box and say, oh, we're now diverse, now everything is fine, and we'll never actually talk about this issue. So that just seems forced and artificial and kind of lazy way to do it, in my opinion. And it's especially strange in this episode, which has a character who is a descendant from a literal Greek god, who has what appears to be magical powers, and we have all these energy entities flying around, and we also have religious people who still believe in gods who they never see or hear from. So it always was a little bit strange in Star Trek how, on the one hand, Picard keeps saying how much he's against the idea of gods and all of that, and then in other episodes he's literally talking with what seems like a god to us, like entities like you and other entities with magical powers which were never really explained in any of the shows. And then in other episodes they say they don't believe in magic or gods and all of that. So how can you say that when you literally had dealings with what appear to be magical entities in other episodes? For example, in the last season of Picard, Riker says that in all their travels, they never ever saw anything that makes him believe in an afterlife. What do you mean? Didn't you hear the story from Picard telling you about how he was in the afterlife and the Q was there and he saved him and all of that? So you heard all those stories, you saw it with your own eyes, that there are all kinds of magical entities, and then you say you don't believe in anything like that, you never saw anything like that. So there's always these kinds of contradictions in Star Trek, which is kind of makes the whole thing kind of ridiculous. And not just you, but also there was that Dowd entity, Kevin, and other entities. And so when you met so many magical entities, how come you are so sure that Ardra must be faking her powers when she could have also been such an alien? So how come you were so sure she was using technology and she's just a normal humanoid? So there are always all these strange contradictions in the shows. And now we have this demigod character, and she has all these electrical powers, and yet she was able to hide it, and no one ever detected that she has any of these powers, and they allow her to be in Starfleet. Isn't that kind of dangerous, since, you know, we did have all those instances of people like Gary Mitchell, who also had magical electrical powers, and he went nuts and tried to take over the universe and whatever. So shouldn't Starfleet be screening people better? Isn't Starfleet against the idea of enhanced humans? They're even against simple genetic engineering, and yet they keep allowing people with magical god powers into Starfleet without any problems, but a genetically engineered human is suddenly a big problem. So that's one of the many contradictions I mentioned. So anyway, they keep trying to make peace between the spheres and the cubes and the spheres keep fighting each other in the corridors and all of that. It's kind of similar to a lot of episodes of TNG, when Picard was always trying to solve all kinds of conflicts and inviting warring parties to the ship, and then they were fighting each other in the corridors and all of that. So it's similar to that. Here it's kind of too ridiculous because these are energy entities and they keep zapping each other and all of that, and then they find out that one of the cubes is missing, and they go into his quarters and they find his remains, what they think are his remains, on the wall. And so they think one of the spheres might have killed one of the cubes, and one of the spheres also turns out missing. And then in the end of the episode, it turns out one of the spheres and one of the cubes simply fell in love and were making love in those quarters, and those remains they saw on the wall was basically the leftover of their love making, which is kind of strange, since didn't they say they're made from pure energy? So why are they leaving around all this protoplasm on the walls and all of that? And in the end of the episode, when there's almost an all-out war between the spheres and the cubes, then they show up and reveal their love to the others, and then reveal their baby, which is half cube, half sphere, and that's what stops the war and makes peace between these two different groups, because they realize they're not so different from each other and all of that. So again, the idea is nice, the execution is kind of a little bit too silly in my opinion, but I guess this is a part of the show, so anything goes. So I'm not annoyed by the episode, but I'm also not that impressed by it, because it was all kind of too simplistic, too childish, and not really that funny, not really that interesting or entertaining. And I'm also not sure what they're going to do with this new character later on, because it's kind of too late to introduce a new character into the cast when the season and the series is almost over. So I'm wondering what else they can possibly do with her that will be interesting. So that's all I had to say about it for now. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it all in the comments below. And I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.